کنفرانس مطبوعاتی استرون استیونسون، رئیس هیئت رابطه با عراق در پارلمان اروپا، پیرامون تحولات مربوط به اشرف و لیبرتی. اسکاتلند 17 اوت 2012 27 مرداد 91. وظایف جامعه جهانی و تعهدات مشخص سازمان ملل، دولت آمریکا و اتحادیه اروپا برای وادار کردن دولت عراق به اجرای تعهدات و خاتمه رفتار ضد انسانی و زندانسازی در لیبرتی.
I think all of us in this room who have an interest in Ashraf and who are interested in supporting the People's Mujahideen of Iran and the National Council for Resistance in Iran do so because we believe that the Iranian regime, the mullahs, Ali Khamenei and Ahmadinejad, represent one of the most dangerous regimes in the world today, one of the most oppressive regimes, and a regime which actually could not only destabilize the entire Middle East, but could pose a threat to world peace with the relentless development of their nuclear weapons inside Iran. And it was the PMOI at huge personal risk to their own supporters inside Iran that the Iranians were developing nuclear weapons. Despite that, the Americans have insisted on keeping the PMOI NCRI on their terror blacklist in America. I pointed out in a speech in Washington 3 years ago that they had good company. Nelson Mandela was still on the list at that time, 3 years ago in America. To this day, Hezbollah is not on that list, unbelievably. But the federal courts in America have now given Hillary Clinton and the State Department until the 1st of October to remove the PMOI NCRI from that list or give legal reasons why they wish to retain them on the list, or the courts have said, we will remove them, which is unprecedented. The justiciary in America and the State Department, never the twain shall meet. And for the courts in America to tell the State Department that we have seen the so-called classified evidence, and I've seen it because it was the same evidence that the British courts insisted be made public when they said there was no case to answer, and the judges said it was perverse for the British government ever to have placed the PMOI on the UK terror list, and they ordered Parliament to remove them. And subsequently it was discovered that it was at the application of the UK government that the EU had placed the PMOI on the EU terror list, and they were forced to take them off. And having delisted the PMOI across the whole of Europe now, the Americans are sitting on the fence based on the same so-called classified evidence, most of which, when we saw it, was stuff prepared by the intelligence services in Tehran. There was even, I was fascinated to see in this massive document released by the British courts, a 4-page transcript of a telephone call with me, where somebody saying they were from the Foreign Office phoned me up in my office in Brussels and said, we don't think it's a good idea that you should be going to Berlin to speak at a PMOI rally. And I said, why not? And they said, because these are terrorists. And I said, well, on the contrary, I think these are heroes, and I fully intend to go to Berlin. Who am I speaking to? And I was told a name, a Mrs. Brown or something, and I was told the telephone number. And the minute she hung up, I asked my staff to phone back to the Foreign Office and speak to this lady. And of course, when they did so, reception at Foreign Office said they didn't have a Mrs. Brown working there. And when the courts in England released the transcript of evidence, lo and behold, who had phoned me up Mrs. Brown from MI5. So our security services were telling an elected parliamentarian how I should conduct myself. Unbelievable. But that is the extent to this day that annoys me about this case. As we all know, these people who were originally fleeing from the mullahs when they were cracking down on the opposition inside Iran, fled to Iraq, set up Ashraf 26 years ago now, built it at huge effort and cost into a small city with hospitals, with living accommodation, dining accommodation, shops, factories, workshops. They were producing goods which enabled them to earn money inside Iraq, to enable them to pay for their own continuation there. After the American invasion, they were disarmed by the Americans because they were an armed opposition faction at that time. And the Americans interviewed every single one of them in Camp Ashraf. 3,500 people, half of them women. Every single one was interviewed. And at the end of extensive interviews by the FBI, CIA, each one was given a sort of passport with their photograph on it from the American military, saying these people were not found to have any connection to terrorism whatsoever, and they were guaranteed the safety and security under the Americans in perpetuity inside Iraq. The Americans, of course, now have left Iraq and taken that pledge with them. And not only that, they are now reneging on that pledge, which of course would serve the mullahs very well, because the mullahs recognize the PMI as their main opposition group. The mullahs, after the 2009 uprising following the fraudulent election of Ahmadinejad in 2009, they have become very nervous, very tense. They're extremely worried about their own position. Their biggest ally, Bashar al-Assad, is now in his, hopefully, last days in power in Syria, where apparently now he only controls about 25% of the entire country. This was the big ally of the mullahs, and they're extremely nervous that their ally will be lost. And they are now looking to Nouri al-Maliki, the Prime Minister of Iraq, as their puppet to extend their evil influence into that country. Of course, Maliki, who lost the election to Ayad Alawi by 2 seats, then ran to Tehran, and they forced Muqtada al-Sadr with his faction, who hated Maliki, by the way. They forced him to join the coalition with Maliki. They got the Kurds and enough people, enough supporters to give Maliki a narrow majority to form a government and to become again the prime minister. And he owes his continuation in that role entirely to the mullahs in Tehran. And as long as that situation continues, every time Maliki goes to Tehran, he is told what he should do about the PMOI. He went there in April and met with the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, who said to him, Prime Minister Maliki, you have made 4 wonderful accomplishments which will never be forgotten. First of all, you expelled the Americans from your territory. Secondly, you are in the process of evicting the MEK from Camp Ashraf. Thirdly, you have cracked down on the Sunni Ba'athist elements in your own government, notably your own vice president, elected vice president Hashemi, who has now fled for his life and is still living in Erbil in safety. And fourthly, your support for Bashar al-Assad. These are the four accomplishments in the eyes of Ali Khamenei. An utter disgrace that anyone could say such a thing publicly and announce it proudly. But this, I tell you, to give you an example of the way Nouri al-Maliki works and where his orders come from. So top of the agenda every time he goes to Tehran is, what are you doing about Ashraf? And that was the reason the two massacres took place. So we said to the government of Iraq, we will come in with a team from the UN, with UN observers and monitors to make sure this is all done properly and safely, and we'll interview and resettle these people to safe countries, and your question of Ashraf will be solved. And Maliki said, no, you won't. You're not coming to interview any of these people in Ashraf. And okay, we'll take them out of the gates of Ashraf and interview them outside. He said, no, you will move them to another camp altogether. And the Americans then said, we agree with this. We have some old military bases out in the desert where we can send these people. When we looked at these former military bases, these were completely unacceptable. The motive was to harass and intimidate and coerce and bully these people during the process of moving them to Camp Liberty, in order that they would try to get these people to say, we've had enough, just send us back to Iran. And this, of course, was what the mullahs in Tehran were looking for. This would have been the ideal position for them. But now we had the appointment of a special envoy from the UN. Martin Kobler was appointed as the UN Special Representative in Iraq, and his key issue to deal with was to ensure that these 3,200 people in Ashraf were safely moved to Camp Liberty, to this 40,000 acre huge camp, interviewed by UNHCR and then sent to friendly countries. Hillary Clinton appointed Ambassador Dan Fried as special envoy for Ashraf to deal with this problem as well. Even in Europe, we had Cathy Ashton appointing a special envoy who lasted about 6 weeks and then threw in the towel and hasn't been replaced since. So there was a global movement to recognize the importance of this issue and to avoid any further violence and bloodshed. But very quickly I discovered that the move that was being proposed by the government of Iraq from Camp Ashraf to Camp Liberty was nothing more than a hoax. They weren't going to be moved into a 40,000 acre camp at all. In fact, they were being given half a square kilometre with huge wire fences built all around it, with several layers of military guards, with police stations inside, with no mains connection to the Baghdad water supply, with no adequate generators for electricity. The generators that were being given to them were the ones left behind by the Americans, dilapidated, broken down, many of them 12 years old or older, completely unsuitable. The containers in which they were supposed to live were in a dilapidated and equally broken down condition. The surface area of the camp, the half square kilometre, was gravel over which disabled people would not be able to walk. And when we realized this and made objections known to Ambassador Fried and Martin Kobler, the UN Special Representative, we were then told that Martin Kobler was coming with a team from Baghdad to see me in my office in Brussels with some of my colleagues who'd been objecting to these conditions. And he brought a beautiful book of photographs of Camp Liberty. And in each of these photographs, he would show us the interior of these beautiful containers with bunk beds and cupboards in pristine condition, a lovely dining hall with state-of-the-art cooking facilities, trees and plants and grassland areas, and page after page of these beautiful blown-up photographs left me saying, the school I went to was worse than this. And one of my colleagues who did his national service in the Spanish army said the army camps he was in were worse than this. And we got in touch with Mrs. Rajavi in Paris and said, we really can't see that there's a valid reason to object to moving the first 600 people from Ashraf to Liberty. To us, it looks perfectly okay. We have subsequently been told, ladies and gentlemen, by a person who was working for the UN and who left his job and his career after many years as a high official with the UN because of his disgust at what I'm about to tell you, that for 1 week, Martin Kobler, the UN Special Representative, had his whole team in Baghdad working on photoshopping these photographs. And when they took them back day after day to him, he would reject them and say, no, you can still see some rust on this pipe. Get rid of that. You can still see, this area is brown. It should be green grass. They photoshopped and faked these photographs and brought them to the European Parliament to defraud us. And I feel guilty having been persuaded and tricked, hoaxed by this deception. I feel guilty that I then fell for this and told Mrs. Rajavi to overcome her resistance and to move the first 600 people into what has become nothing more than a prison. And then when the first move was agreed to, the humiliation really started. It took more than 24 hours for these people to be almost strip searched. Every item that they took with them was unfolded, emptied out, searched again and again before they were allowed eventually to move to Camp Liberty. They were denied wheelchairs, personal medicines, other personal effects. They're still being told that they cannot build at their own expense canopies to shelter them from the heat, the blistering sunshine over there at this time of year. They're being told that they cannot take covers or building material to build pathways to enable people in wheelchairs and people who've lost legs and are on crutches to maneuver between the containers they have to sleep in and the dining hall. All of this camp is in a dilapidated condition. The generators break down all the time. The sewage from day one, the pipes were fracturing and the place was flooding with rotten sewage. They have been saying at their own expense from day one, 6 months ago when they first moved there, that they would meet the expense of connecting Camp Liberty to the Baghdad mains water supply. And the government of Iraq have consistently said, we will allow that to happen, but have consistently put obstacles in the way to stop it happening. And 6 months down the line, that's still one of the conditions that we are demanding. One of the Ashrafi people, under incredible stress and fatigue, arriving in Camp Liberty, then died of a heart attack. And now, 150 days later, his body is still being held by the Iraqi authorities. They will not release it to his family, in total breach of not only humanitarian laws, but of even the basic tenets of Islam. And this is absolutely disgraceful. This sort of behavior epitomizes the way the Iraqis are dealing with this. And one of the biggest contempts of all was the appointment as commander of the military in charge of the people in Camp Liberty of none other than Colonel Sadek. He was one of the key commanding officers during the 2 massacres that led to the deaths of 49 people in Camp Ashraf. And with utter contempt, the government of Iraq have appointed him as the commander of Camp Liberty. And he is the one who makes their lives on a daily basis an absolute misery. His most recent cruelty is that when lorries, truckloads filled with foodstuffs arrive at Camp Liberty in 55 degrees heat, he now insists on them being stopped just inside the gates. Remember, by the time they get inside Camp Liberty, they have gone through about 6 checkpoints with sniffer dogs, X-ray machines, police searches, but he stops them just inside the gates and tells the civilian residents of Liberty to unload them by hand. We're talking here tons, maybe 20 tons of food in a truck. He has denied them the right to bring their forklift trucks from Camp Ashraf. That has been a constant source of concern, but they have been denied the right to bring forklifts, and they have to unload everything, all the bags of rice and food, by hand in the heat. And it then sits on the ground for 6 or 7 hours before SADC sends any inspectors, any guards to search through it and check it for heaven knows what. By that time, the food is wasted, is rotten. Then he will not allow them to reload the trucks and take the trucks to the unloading bays, which are already there in Camp Liberty. He only allows them to take all the foodstuffs in the boots of the 1 or 2 personal cars that they were allowed to take with them from Ashraf to Liberty. These are all ways of coercing, bullying, humiliating these people, making them do physical hard labor in the blistering heat while watching the foodstuffs that they have paid for ruin in the high temperatures. So when you consider that the reason we are dealing with this problem is because Martin Kobler signed a memorandum of understanding with the government of Iraq without the agreement of the people of Ashraf, without the agreement of me and my colleagues in the European Parliament. And that memorandum of understanding, which Kobler has repeatedly assured us, means that they will be treated in a completely humanitarian way. That has been defied to the letter by the government of Iraq on a day-by-day basis. I get daily reports, as possibly many of you do, to tell me what's happening in Camp Liberty. And you can see on a day-by-day basis how the basic elements of the memorandum of understanding are being denied. So no wonder, with 2,000 people now incarcerated in these prison-like conditions, where they are not allowed to leave, they have no freedom of movement, they can't leave Camp Liberty, they are not allowed to see members of their family who can't go into Camp Liberty, they are not allowed to meet politicians like me, or even lawyers, in absolute fundamental disdain for all the key elements of refugee status. These people are the brave representatives of the main opposition group to the most dangerous regime in the world today. I think they deserve our support, they deserve our help, and it's time the Americans and the UN showed some spine and stood up to Nouri al-Maliki and said to him, your behavior in the past and your behavior right now is completely unacceptable, and you will no longer enjoy our support and our investment from the West unless you start behaving properly, live up to your memorandum of understanding that you signed with the UN, show proper, decent, dignified respect for the human rights of these people. Thank you very much.